I'd sell my soul for a way out of this place. Anjali spat, the taste of blood metallic on her tongue. Indira, hand still raised, glared at her. You ungrateful wretch. After all I've done for you. Done for me? Anjali laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You've trapped me here, Indira, just like you trapped Mama. Javier stepped between them, his hands outstretched. Stop, both of you. It's this storm, it's making everyone crazy. The wind howled outside, a relentless assault on their fragile hut. Rain lashed against the shutters, mirroring the turmoil inside. Stay out of this, Javier, Indira snapped, her eyes blazing. This little viper needs to learn respect. Respect? Anjali challenged, her eyes locked on Indira's. You want respect? Earn it, a frail voice called from the corner. Children, please, stop this fighting. Abuela Elena, Javier's grandmother, huddled in her shawl, her voice trembling. Javier turned to his grandmother, his face etched with worry. Abuela, are you all right? He crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking her frail hand in his. Just a little scared, mijo, she whispered, her eyes darting between Anjali and Indira. A sudden crash from outside punctuated her words. The door burst open, and Elena, Javier's mother, stumbled in, soaked to the bone and shivering. Indira. She threw me out. Said I was bad luck. Anjali rushed to Elena's side, wrapping a blanket around her trembling shoulders. Stay here, Mama. You're safe here. She shot a venomous look at Indira. Unlike some. Javier, Anjali commanded. Help me board the windows. They worked quickly, hammering planks across the shutters as the wind screamed around them, a wild beast clawing at their wall. Padre Miguel's voice, amplified by the wind, carried from the nearby church. The sea gives and the sea takes. Repent your sins. The storm raged through the night. The next morning, a fragile calm settled over the devastated village. Anjali walked along the beach, the sand littered with debris. Fishing boats lay splintered, nets tangled amongst the wreckage. Something glinted in the morning sun, half buried in the sand. She bent down, digging it out. A raw, uncut gemstone, the size of her thumb, pulsed with an inner fire. It felt warm in her hand. Later that day, Anjali sat with Elena, mending a torn fishing net. Mama, she whispered, look what I found. She opened her hand, revealing the gemstone. Elena gasped, her eyes widening. Anjali, where? On the beach, in the wreckage. Keep it quiet, Elena hissed, glancing nervously towards Indira. This could be our way out, away from her. Anjali nodded, the seed of an idea taking root in her mind. She avoided Javier's gaze for the rest of the day. That night, she lay awake, the gemstone, a heavy weight in her pocket. The storm had passed, but the turmoil inside her raged on. The next morning, she woke to find Javier staring at her, his expression a mixture of hurt and suspicion. What's wrong, Javier? She asked, feigning innocence. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated. Nothing, he finally mumbled, turning away. But the look in his eyes told her he knew she was hiding something. Over the next few days, Anjali subtly questioned the other villagers, trying to gauge the gemstone's worth. Old man Tiberio, who had spent his life at sea, examined it with a practiced eye. It's fire opal, he declared. Rare and valuable. He offered her a handful of pesos, but Anjali shook her head. She knew it was worth more. A sleek, white yacht anchored in the harbour, a stark contrast to the battered fishing boats. Don Ricardo, a wealthy businessman known for exploiting the local fishermen, stepped ashore. He was a portly man with a predatory smile and eyes that glittered with avarice. I'm looking for rare treasures, he announced to the gathered villagers. Elena leaned close to Anjali, her voice urgent. Here's your chance, Anjali. Don't be a fool. That evening, Anjali watched from a distance as Don Ricardo berated fishermen for the meager catch. He threw a handful of coins at the man's feet. This is all you're worth, he sneered. Anjali felt a knot of unease in her stomach. Was this truly her escape route? Javier confronted her again, his voice trembling. You're hiding something, Anjali. I can feel it. Anjali's heart pounded in her chest. It's nothing, Javier. Just women's things. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. He turned away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Indira watched their exchange, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Anjali spent the next day wrestling with her conscience. She practiced her lies. Going fishing with Papa Tiberio, she told Indira. Helping Elena mend nets, she told Javier. Each lie felt like a stone in her gut. She saw Indira inspecting her meager belongings, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. Anjali's hands clenched. Elena, noticing her unease, grabbed her hand. He's leaving tomorrow, Anjali. This is our last chance. Fear tightened Anjali's chest, but the thought of freedom spurred her on. She found Don Ricardo by the docks, his yacht gleaming white against the backdrop of the setting sun. I have something you might want, Anjali said, her voice barely a whisper. Don Ricardo raised a skeptical eyebrow. Show me. She hesitated for a moment, then revealed the gemstone. He examined it closely, a glint of greed in his eyes. He pulled out a small pouch of coins, offering it to her. It was a paltry sum, far less than what old man Tiberio had offered. It's worth more, Anjali insisted, her voice trembling. He chuckled, a condescending sound. Not to me. Take it or leave it. Anjali's mind raced. She glanced back at the village, at the small hut she shared with her family, at Indira's hawk-like gaze. She took a deep breath and snatched the pouch. It was heavier than she expected. She ran back to the hut, Elena waiting impatiently. Did you do it? Anjali nodded, spilling the coins onto the table. Elena gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. We can leave tonight. They began packing frantically, throwing clothes and a few precious belongings into a small bag. Javier entered the hut, stopping dead in his tracks. He stared at the coins scattered across the table, his face pale. Where did you get this? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Anjali froze her, the weight of her deception crushing her. This was the midpoint. Where did you get this? Javier repeated, his voice rising. It's nothing, Anjali stammered, clutching the empty pouch. Nothing. Javier pointed to the coins. This is more money than we've seen in a year. Where did it come from? Elena stepped forward, her voice sharp. It's none of your business, Javier. It is my business. This is my family. He turned to Anjali, his eyes pleading. Tell me the truth, Anjali, please. Anjali looked from Javier's anguished face to Elena's hardened expression. She took a deep breath. I sold something. Sold what? Anjali hesitated. A gemstone. I found it on the beach after the storm. Javier's face crumpled. You sold a gemstone? To whom? Don Ricardo. Javier recoiled as if she'd struck him. Don Ricardo? That thief? He's cheated us for years. He'll have given you a pittance for something valuable. It was enough, Anjali said defiantly. Enough to get us away from here. Away from Indira. Away from me. Javier's voice cracked. You leaving? With Mama? Without me? You can come with us, Elena said quickly, her eyes gleaming. We'll start a new life. Just the three of us. Javier shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. And what about Abuela? What about the village? This is our home. It's a prison, Anjali retorted. And I won't stay here any longer. Anjali, please, Javier begged. Don't do this. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. It's too late, Javier. We're leaving tonight. The argument continued, escalating with each exchange. Abuela Elena, awakened by the commotion, pleaded with them to stop. Indira, drawn by the raised voices, entered the hut, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. The scene descended into chaos, accusations flying like daggers. You think you can just walk away? Indira screamed, her face contorted with rage. You owe me, Anjali. You owe me for everything. I owe you nothing, Anjali shouted back. Javier tried to intervene, but his words were lost in the storm of their anger. He looked from Anjali's defiant face to Indira's furious expression, his heart breaking. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the hut. Everyone froze. They looked up to see a large fissure snaking across the ceiling. The hut, weakened by the storm, was starting to collapse. Get out, Javier yelled, pushing Anjali and Elena towards the door. He turned back to help his grandmother, but Indira grabbed his arm. Leave her. She's worthless. Javier hesitated, torn between his grandmother and his mother. No, we can't leave her. Another crack, louder this time. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The walls groaned. Javier pushed Indira towards the door. Go, I'll get Abuela. He raced to his grandmother's side, lifting her frail body into his arms. He stumbled towards the door, debris falling around him. He reached the doorway just as the roof caved in, plunging the hut into darkness. Outside, Anjali and Elena watched in horror as the hut collapsed. They screamed Javier's name, their voices raw with terror. The villagers, alerted by a commotion, rushed to the scene, frantically digging through the rubble. After what felt like an eternity, they pulled Javier from the wreckage, coughing and covered in dust. He was alive, but his grandmother was still trapped inside. The villagers continued digging, their faces grim. Finally, they reached Abuela Elena. She was still breathing, but barely. They carried her to Padre Miguel's church, the only building in the village that had survived the storm relatively unscathed. Padre Miguel tended to her wounds, his face etched with concern. He looked at Anjali, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. The sea gives, and the sea takes, he murmured, his voice heavy with meaning. Sometimes we must let go of what we covet most. Anjali sat beside her grandmother, holding her frail hand. She looked at the coins she had clutched in her other hand, the price of her freedom. They felt heavy, like stones. She realized that her escape had come at a terrible cost. Elena sat across from her, her face pale and drawn. The excitement of escape had vanished, replaced by fear and regret. She reached out and took Anjali's hand, squeezing it tightly. Javier stood by the doorway, watching them. His face was bruised and scratched, his eyes filled with pain. He looked at Anjali, and she saw the unspoken accusation in his gaze. She had betrayed him, betrayed their family, for a handful of coins. Days turned into weeks. Abuela Elena slowly recovered, but the village was devastated. The fishing boats were destroyed, the nets tangled and useless. The villagers faced starvation. Anjali tried to help, working alongside Javier and the others to rebuild their lives. But the weight of her guilt was a constant burden. She had traded her family's well-being for a dream of escape that now seemed hollow and meaningless. One evening, as the sun set over the ravaged village, Anjali sat alone on the beach. She took the coins from her pocket and threw them to the sea, one by one. They disappeared into the waves, swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. She looked back at the village, at the small hut that was slowly being rebuilt, at Javier standing by the doorway, watching her. She knew she could never truly undo what she had done, but she could try to make amends. She could stay and help rebuild, not just the village, but also the trust she had broken. She could choose family over freedom, and hope that one day Javier could forgive her. She stood up and walked towards him, the setting sun casting long shadows on the sand. She stopped in front of him, her eyes meeting his. "I'm staying," she said quietly. He didn't say anything, but she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, and for the first time in a long time, Anjali felt a sense of peace. The sea had taken much, but it had also given her a second chance.